Welcome back to Singapore Property Talk Law. So, Chinese New Year is almost here, huh? Time for family, big feasts, and maybe even some property hunting.
Well, maybe not so much hunting, to be honest. But it definitely is a time when, you see some interesting stuff happening in the Singapore property market. I'm Stareen, by the way.
And I'm Damien. Always love digging into how these cultural trends, can really shake things up when it comes to real estate, especially in the Lion City. We've got a whole bunch of articles and some research piled up here. And our goal today is to figure out what it all means for you, whether you're buying, selling, or just, obsessed with this crazy market.
Right.
So how does Lunar New Year, with all the traditions and everything, actually affect property here in Singapore?
Well, let's start with the basics. I mean, a lot of agents actually take pretty long breaks around this time to celebrate with family.
Yeah, makes sense.
So if you're thinking of selling and hoping to get tons of viewings during the holidays, you might be in for a bit of a surprise.
Gotcha. Timing is everything,
Right.
especially if you want to get your property out there fast.
Exactly.
But it's not just about whether agents are available, right? There's like this whole cultural side to it, too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about numerology, for example. It's a really big deal for a lot of Chinese buyers. And we're not talking about like just a casual preference here. I mean, there's research out there showing that apartments on the 8th floor, because it's considered lucky, can actually go for like 5% more in some cases.
Wow, okay.
And then on the flip side, if your unit is on the 4th floor, well, that's associated with bad luck.
Right.
So you might actually end up selling for 2 to 3% less.
So those lucky numbers, they can actually make a real difference in your wallet. It's not just superstition. It's like a market factor, like you said. But I'm curious, does this mean that even if a buyer isn't personally superstitious, they might still pay more for a lucky address?
You're totally right. Smart buyers, they get it. They understand that these preferences can affect how much their property is worth when they go to sell it later on, especially in a market like Singapore where we have such a large Chinese population.
Right.
Catering to those cultural preferences, well, it can be a really savvy investment strategy.
So it's like you're not just thinking about yourself, you're thinking about who might buy it from you down the road.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. So we've got this potential slowdown in local activity. People are traveling, families are getting together. But what about the impact of like overseas buyers during Chinese New Year?
Right. That's a big piece of the puzzle. Historically, I mean, Chinese New Year has been a huge time for buyers coming in from overseas, especially from mainland China.
Okay.
It's like this prime time for investment. And Singapore, with its reputation for stability and good returns, it's often at the top of their list.
Yeah, totally. But what about like with all the travel restrictions and everything that's still going on, how does that affect things?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, virtual tours and all those online property platforms, they've definitely become more popular. But at the end of the day, nothing really beats being there in person.
Yeah, you can't quite get the same feel. So we've got this potential dip in local activity, and then there's this uncertainty about how many overseas buyers we'll see. How does that actually translate into real numbers in the market? We've got a snapshot of the market here from February 2024, and it looks like new private home sales, they actually took a dip.
Yeah, they did. And it's probably due to a bunch of different things happening all at once. For one thing, we saw about 10% fewer new project launches compared to last year. Developers might be holding back, waiting till after the holidays to launch anything new. And then we can't forget about interest rates. They've gone up, too, by about 0.5% since last year.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So borrowing is more expensive now, and that could be making some buyers hesitate.
So it's kind of a mixed bag, isn't it? Some potential opportunities popping up while things are slowing down a bit. This is a good question for our listeners, then. If you're a buyer, could this whole Chinese New Year lull be a chance to, like, snag a good deal?
It's definitely possible. With fewer buyers competing, there might be more room for negotiation. Sellers might be more willing to work with you, especially if they're trying to wrap things up before the new year.
Oh, that's interesting.
But remember, even if things are slower, you still got to be prepared. Make sure your finances are in order, research the areas you're interested in, and have a clear idea of what you can afford and what you absolutely won't budge on.
That's solid advice. And what about for sellers? What should they be thinking about during this time?
Well, if you happen to be selling a property with a lucky number, this could be your time to shine. Play that up in your marketing. You might attract buyers who are specifically looking for those auspicious addresses.
Okay.
It could give you a real advantage, especially when the market's a bit quieter.
So it's all about highlighting those unique selling points that tap into those cultural
Yeah,
preferences.
exactly.
But what if your property doesn't have that lucky number thing going for it? What else can you do to stand out during this period?
You can definitely still make your property stand out. One thing you can focus on is creating a really warm, welcoming atmosphere when people come for viewings. Remember, it's a festive season, so why not incorporate some subtle Chinese New Year decorations?
Yeah, good point.
It adds to the appeal and might help create a more positive emotional connection with potential buyers.
It's like tapping into that whole spirit of the season and showing people that your place is somewhere they can build happy memories. But let's be real, not everyone's going to be in the mood to go house hunting when they're busy with family gatherings and celebrations.
You're right about that. That's why it's so important to be strategic with your marketing. Think about focusing on those online platforms, like, where buyers might be browsing when they have a few minutes to spare, and
Ah,
social media too.
yeah,
Use it to share some festive greetings and showcase your property in a way that fits with the whole celebratory vibe.
those are some good ideas.
Yeah.
It's about adapting to the situation and finding creative ways to reach those potential buyers. The ones who might not be actively looking, but are still open to checking things out. Now, we've talked about how both buyers and sellers can potentially benefit during this period, but what about the overall market outlook? Are there any, warning signs that investors should be paying attention to?
Well, like with any investment, you always want to be cautious, right? One thing to watch out for is those rising interest rates we talked about. Even though a 0.5% increase might not seem like much, it can really add up over time. You're talking potentially thousands of dollars more over the life of your mortgage.
Yeah, that's true.
And that could make things less affordable for some buyers.
It's easy to forget how those small percentage changes can really make a big difference when it comes to owning a home.
Right. So even though there might be some good deals to be had during Chinese New Year, buyers need to be careful and make sure they're not overextending themselves financially.
Definitely some food for thought there. So rising interest rates, that's one thing. What else should investors have on their radar?
Well, another thing that's often overlooked is the impact of government policies. Over the years, the government has introduced a bunch of cooling measures to try and prevent too much speculation and keep the market stable.
Right, those measures are supposed to prevent those wild price swings that you see in some other markets.
Exactly. But these policies can also affect whether people decide to buy or sell. So it's important to stay updated on any new rules or changes to the existing
It's
ones.
like there's this whole set of rules that's always changing and can really shake things up.
You got it. And that's why having a good real estate advisor, someone you can trust, is so important. They can help you navigate all those complexities.
Yeah, especially during a unique time like Chinese New Year, having someone who understands the market and can guide you through the process is invaluable. Now, before we move on, I want to go back to something we mentioned earlier, the whole tradition of settling debts before the new year. How might that actually affect the market?
Okay, well, think about it this way. If businesses, especially those involved in property, are trying to clear their books and start the new year fresh, it could actually lead to more property transactions in the weeks leading up to Chinese New Year.
Okay.
You might see developers offering more incentives or sellers becoming more flexible with their prices to close deals faster.
So it's like this cultural practice is creating a sense of urgency and maybe even shifting things more in favor of the buyer.
Exactly. It's a really interesting example of how these traditions that might seem unrelated can actually have a real impact on the market.
It definitely shows how important it is to understand the cultural context when you're analyzing the Singapore property market.
Couldn't agree more. That's what makes this market so fascinating.
Well, I think we've given our listeners plenty to think about so far. We've looked at how both buyers and sellers can potentially benefit, talked about the bigger picture of the market, and even dug into how cultural traditions can influence things. Now, when we come back, we'll wrap things up with some key takeaways and some practical advice for anyone looking to navigate the Singapore property market during this special time of year. Stick around. Welcome back to Singapore Property Talk Law. Before the break, we were just talking about how all the Chinese New Year's celebrations can actually create some cool opportunities in the Singapore property market. So how can buyers and sellers use these trends to their advantage?
Well, let's start with buyers. Okay,
Hmm.
so if you're thinking about buying a place, this calmer period, with less competition, it could be the perfect time to make a move. You might even find that sellers are a bit more open to negotiating, especially if they want to close deals before the new year.
It's like a secret advantage for those who are prepared and ready to act.
Exactly. But even though there might be fewer buyers out there, you still got to be ready. Get your finances sorted out, do your research on those neighborhoods you're interested in, and know your budget. And, figure out those things you absolutely won't budge on.
Makes sense. What about sellers, though? Any tips for them during this time?
Well, if you're lucky enough to be selling a place with a lucky number, now's the time to shout it from the rooftops. Really emphasize it in your marketing. You might attract buyers who are specifically looking for those auspicious addresses, and that could give you a real leg up, especially when the market's a bit slow.
So play up those cultural selling points. I like it. But what if your property doesn't have that lucky number going for it? How can you still stand out?
Oh, there are definitely ways. One thing you can try is focusing on creating a really warm and inviting atmosphere during viewings. It's the festive season, so why not add a few subtle touches of Chinese New Year decor?
Yeah, I like that.
It can make your place feel more appealing and might create a better connection with potential buyers.
It's like tapping into the holiday spirit, showing people that this is a place where they can create their own traditions and memories. But let's face it, not everyone's going to be focused on house hunting when they've got family gatherings and celebrations on their minds.
You're absolutely right. And that's why it's super important to be smart about your marketing. For example, maybe focus on those online platforms where buyers might be browsing during their downtime. And don't forget about social media.
Oh, yeah.
Use it to share those holiday greetings and showcase your property in a way that really fits with the whole festive mood.
Good ideas. It's all about being flexible and finding those creative ways to connect with potential buyers, right? Even those who might not be actively looking. Okay, so we've talked about the potential pluses for buyers and sellers. But what about the bigger picture? Are there any red flags or warning signs investors should watch out for?
Well, with any investment, you got to be cautious, right? One thing to keep an eye on is those rising interest rates we were talking about. Even though that 0.5% increase might seem small, it can really add up over the years. I mean, you could be talking about thousands of dollars extra over the life of a mortgage.
It's easy to overlook how those small percentage changes can add up to big bucks when you're talking about home ownership.
For sure. So yeah, even though there could be some bargains out there during Chinese New Year, buyers need to be really thoughtful and make sure they're not getting in over their heads financially.
So true. Rising interest rates, that's definitely one to watch. Anything else investors should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think another factor that often gets overlooked is the impact of government policies. I mean, over the years, the government's put in place a bunch of cooling measures to try and stop too much speculation and keep the market steady.
Right. Those measures are meant to keep things from getting too crazy and prevent those huge price swings that we've seen in other places.
Exactly, but these policies can also affect decisions about buying and selling. So you got to stay updated on any new rules or changes to the existing ones.
So it's like this set of rules that's constantly evolving and can really shake things up.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that's exactly why having a trusted real estate advisor, someone who really knows their stuff, is super important. They can help you make sense of it all.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Having that expert guidance can be super valuable, especially during a unique time like Chinese New Year. Before we move on, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. That tradition of settling debts before the new year. How might that actually play out in the market?
Well, let's think about it like this. If businesses, especially those in the property world, are really motivated to clean up their books and start fresh in the new year, it could actually lead to more property transactions in those weeks leading up to Chinese New Year.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we might see more developers offering incentives or maybe sellers getting more flexible with pricing just to get those deals done quickly.
So it's almost like this cultural practice is creating a sense of urgency and maybe even giving buyers a little bit more leverage.
Exactly. It just goes to show you how these traditions, even if they seem unrelated, can have a real tangible impact on the market.
It really emphasizes how important it is to factor in that cultural context when you're looking at the Singapore property market.
Couldn't agree more. It's part of what makes this market so unique and interesting.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on so far. We've looked at how this period can be good for both buyers and sellers, talked about the bigger market trends, and even dug into those cultural nuances that shape decisions. In our final segment, we'll wrap things up with some key takeaways and some practical tips for anyone trying to navigate the Singapore property market during this special time of year. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Singapore Property Talk Law. We've covered a lot of ground today, talking about how Chinese New Year traditions and, all those market forces kind of work together. But before we wrap things up, let's try and boil all this down to some actual advice for a listener. So what's the one big takeaway you want everyone to remember?
It's actually pretty simple. Don't underestimate the power of really understanding the culture. Whether you're buying or selling, it makes a difference. Recognize how those traditions, like the numerology, the whole settling debts thing, even just that festive atmosphere, they can all impact what happens in the market. Knowing that can give you a real edge.
Yeah, totally. It's not just about looking at the numbers. It's about understanding what makes people tick, those cultural things that drive their decisions. So for those listeners who might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed by everything we've talked about, what's like one practical thing they can do right now to get a better handle on the market?
Hmm. I'd say check out some of the resources available online. There are some great links out there. Property portals like 99.co and Property Guru, they have market analyses, price trends, even neighborhood guides. That can help you get a sense of what's going on in specific areas without having to wade through tons of data.
Those are good resources. And hey, remember, knowledge is power, especially in a market like Singapore's that's always changing. So stay informed, do your research, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Now, before we sign off, I want to leave everyone with a final thought. We've talked about how traditions and the economy can create, both opportunities and challenges in the property market. But at the end of the day, the decision to buy or sell, it's personal.
Absolutely. It's all about figuring out how your financial goals fit with, your lifestyle and what you want. And remember, no matter what year it is, whether it's the year of the dragon or whatever, having a good plan, making smart choices, and understanding the culture, all of that can really help you achieve those property dreams.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, Serene. It's been fascinating. And to all our listeners out there, Gom Shifa Kai, may the year ahead be filled with prosperity and happiness. And hey, whether you're buying, selling, or just watching from the sidelines, the Singapore property market is always an interesting ride. Until next time.